Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world, and thank you to our guests for joining us. This event was put together by Frame of Framed, which, if you don't already know, is an Amsterdam-based platform and exhibition space for art and critical theory. And our main aim is really to create a space for dialogue and have a plurality of voices in a globalized society. And that's why it's really important to have an event to talk about what is going on now. And this event, probably unsurprisingly, came about as a direct result of the pandemic when the space was closed. It offered the opportunity to go back into the Frame of Framed archive, which is quite a cliche idea, but it's cliche because it's true when you're looking to your past to figure out what to do with your future. And that's when I was looking at Ian Allan Paul's bio on the Frame of Framed website. And Ian was an artist and contributor for the exhibition As If, the Media Artist as Trickster in 2017. And that focused more on the politically inspired media art that uses deception in all its forms and showed the artist as trickster, using a variety of hoaxes, hacks, and ruses to reveal the hidden workings of power and the possibility of alternative futures. And Ian co-created the artwork, the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History, as a kind of imaginary museum in the exhibition. And at the heart of it was to address today one of the most urgent political issues, which at the time was post-truth politics. But now it's really pressing to discuss the urgent issue we're facing with the current COVID-19 pandemic. And hopefully this good discussion will, I don't know, bring new things to light for you, change your perspective a little bit. We have people from all over the world gathered here today, which is probably wouldn't have happened without the pandemic. So yeah, hopefully we'll all gain a little bit more knowledge with this together. And I'm going to introduce you to our moderator, Shailoh Phillips. She's an artist, activist, researcher, educator, hacker, and community organizer. And she's part of the artist group Tools for Action, and is currently working on a practice-based PhD on the intersections between protest, performance, and photography. And Shailoh is currently based in the Netherlands, teaching theory at multiple art schools. Welcome, Shailoh.
Thank you, Evie. It's true, it's exciting to look at the ways in which the current conditions that distance us also, strangely enough, makes it possible for us to have a conversation with several people here who have never met each other and would be unlikely to do so in these times. So I have the pleasure of introducing you to the wonderful panel of people this evening who will be with us. First is Ian Allan Paul, who, as you described, has worked with Frame of Framed before. The starting point for today's conversation is a text that they wrote, 10 Premises for a Pandemic. I would advise for those who are following along for this to have a look at that text. And today will be an opportunity for us to think through these premises, to think, if you think premises are starting points, are a foundation of some kind for a new era we're in. Do we agree with these premises? How can we flesh them out or be nuanced? What will we build on them? What do we need to take into account now as we're all in this phase of trying to figure out what's going on in our times? So Ian Allan Paul is calling in from Brooklyn today, and they're an artist and a theorist whose work examines instantations of power and practice of resistance in global contexts. And their projects are formally diverse, making use of text, photography, video, and code. And over the course of their life, Ian has lived and taught for extended periods outside of the United States, in Mexico, in Spain, in Egypt, and Palestine, and obtained a PhD in film and digital media studies from UC Santa Cruz, 2016, and now is calling in from New York. I will briefly introduce the other speakers after this, but just so you know who else is on the call. Clara Balaguer, who's well, I'll introduce more, who's my colleague also in another context in Rotterdam, who is part of a collaboration with Zara Christoph, who's not on this call, but has been crucial for the conversation that Clara will be bringing in for this evening. And last but not least, Matthijs de Bruine, who will be also looking more at labor politics as we enter this new era. But first, I hand the baton to Ian Allen Paul, who will run us through these premises and the starting points for this conversation.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And thank you to everyone at Framer Framed who brought us all together today. When Shailoh and I were talking yesterday in preparation for the event, they asked kind of why I wrote the text to begin with, and I've kind of been reflecting on the question. And the answer I keep coming back to is actually kind of based on something Silvia Federici said when someone asked her kind of why she wrote and why she engaged in this kind of practice. And her response was that writing for her was a way of constituting new kinds of commons. And I think yeah, that's my position as well. That I'm excited that this text brought us all together today. And I'm looking forward to kind of seeing where the conversation goes and what new kind of ideas and conversations emerge as a result. I don't want to give a kind of comprehensive summary of the text at the beginning, but I thought it would be helpful to maybe introduce a few of the ideas that frame my kind of thinking around the pandemic and maybe contextualize the conversation to come. Just some general notes to begin with is I think the challenge when trying to think about the pandemic with others is it's really hard to kind of disentangle what's truly novel and new about our situation and what is just a kind of continuation of the world that we're all accustomed to living with. And so kind of trying to differentiate what is new and about our situation, like what new kinds of operations of power are being enacted and what new forms of resistance may be possible in the present is kind of, at least for me, what's so important about trying to think through this in the present moment. But also to understand that we're kind of engaged in much broader histories that certainly exceed the kind of crisis that we find ourselves in the present. The second challenge has to do with the kind of totalizing nature of the pandemic. And so I think it's fair to say that we're all kind of implicated in the pandemic process in one way or another. And so in a way, we can all feel like we're part of something together. And I think it's important to think of that politically and ethically as a kind of conditioned endemic and affected by the pandemic are deeply differential. And so, of course, we all come from different kind of social and economic and geographic positions and experience the pandemic in different ways. And particularly the violence of the pandemic is really expressed quite differently in different places and across different populations and people. And so thinking about the kind of newness of the situation and the kind of continuities with broader histories, and then thinking about the kind of totalizing condition and the kind of differential way in which that totality is enacted, I think that's kind of my entry point to this. I wanted to briefly sketch out a few of the ideas like I mentioned. And while I do that, rather than just be a talking head, I thought I would share some videos that I've been collecting for a while. The videos I have collected here, let me pull up my screen here, are part of a kind of a larger video library that have to do with kind of visualizations. I hope the video is showing, yeah. That have to do with visualizations of the planet and of networks and of people and of surveillance and different kind of visual strategies for thinking through these things together. So the videos that you're going to see now are kind of collected from corporations and governments and research institutes, and they're all kind of ways of that people are introducing new kinds of visual strategies for representing this kind of networked present that we find ourselves in. So very, very briefly, the first kind of idea that I thought was important to introduce and contextualize the conversation today was this idea of control, and particularly this idea of kind of cybernetic power. And I think so much of the way that the pandemic is playing out is kind of inflected by the form of networks. And so we need to think about kind of how this network form changes the way we relate to the pandemic and the way that we live within it. my thinking on control is very much influenced by the writing of Gilles Deleuze and Donna Haraway and Tikkun. And all of them are trying to think through this transition, this kind of historical transition between disciplinary societies and control societies. And that's kind of using the language of Deleuze. Donna Haraway talks about this in terms of the informatics of domination. And Tikkun talks about this in the language of cybernetics, but they're all kind of trying to describe a similar kind of historical phenomena. Largely what they're trying to think through is this kind of shift towards data as a form of abstraction. And how do we think about data as a new kind of media, a new kind of form that mediates social relations and that mediates economic relations. And so when we think about control as a new form of power, what we're largely thinking about is how, when our modes of survival and when our modes of kind of economic well-being and when our modes of kind of cultural production become kind of instantiated and performed on networks, what are the kind of political consequences of that? One of the things that I think thinking the pandemic through the kind of lens of control offers us is it forces us to think less necessarily about the kind of individual body and how the individual body relates to institutions, or the individual body relates to the power of the state in different contexts. Instead, we have to start thinking through questions of kind of individual control and how kind of different forms of data that are collected about us become the means through which we interact with others in society and the means through which the state kind of interacts with us as well. And so because the internet and the networks that we participate in are kind of built upon various structures of surveillance and data collection, this mode of data and this kind of form of data becomes the principal means of kind of social control and the principal means of kind of economic mediation. And so this becomes one of the important entry points for me for thinking about the present moment. The second idea I wanted to very, very briefly introduce was the kind of shifts in labor and economic relations that we're kind of all experiencing now. Principally, the thing that I've been trying to focus on and think through is the ways in which so much economic activity is now shifted into the domestic context. And so we find a new kind of economy and a new kind of workforce really kind of located in their homes. And so we see this kind of real transformation of what we think of as domestic labor. Historically, obviously, kind of domestic labor was the thing that was kind of invisible and erased from economic relations. And now it's become like a very principal part of the global economy in a way. But that, related to this kind of domestic connected economic subject, we have a new kind of precarious class of people, which of course, again, kind of already existed, but now it's kind of vastly grown in a matter of a couple of months. Is this kind of mobile, disposable subject is what I call them. These people that are equally kind of connected to networks through various kind of gig economy apps and ride sharing apps and all these kinds of things. Who now kind of have to put themselves at risk in the moment of the pandemic, at risk of infection, et cetera, in order to kind of sustain the domestic life of this different class of workers. And so we see this new kind of divide in the economy emerging. Outside of this kind of binary that I'm describing, I think another important development in labor and economic life is the emergence of kind of surplus populations. And again, this is kind of a larger kind of historical trajectory, but maybe has become accelerated in the present moment. But certainly in the United States, there's a real kind of explicit conversation happening now about kind of what section of the population is expendable. And kind of if we want to focus on kind of the health of the economy, it seems like opposed to kind of the health of the economy is the health of the population. And so when these things become kind of counterposed in a certain kind of capitalist rationality, what does that mean for how we think about how we engage in certain kinds of struggle or emancipatory politics? When we find that actually big portions of the economy may not actually be required to reproduce capitalist markets and this kind of thing. And the third and final idea, sorry, I'm moving very quickly, but I don't want to take too much time just talking here. The third thing that I think is important to introduce in this conversation is this idea of the politics of vulnerability and interdependency as being the starting point for a new kind of politics that point kind of beyond the pandemic. And again, this isn't something that's entirely novel in our situation, but is certainly kind of necessarily finding new formal expression in the present moment because of all this need to practice social distancing and find new modes of kind of supporting each other that don't resemble past forms of struggle. But rather than kind of think about politics as being dependent upon and founded upon this notion of kind of the liberal, rational, self-sustaining individual that most of kind of liberal democratic societies are founded upon, what would it mean instead to kind of take the vulnerability of people and groups of people as a starting point for thinking about refashioning society? And so this is a kind of question for thinking about organizing the distribution of goods and organizing systems of support in a way that's kind of disentangled from the abstraction of price on the one hand, so the abstraction of the market, and the abstraction of kind of surveillance capitalism on the other, the abstraction of kind of corporate networks and these kinds of things. I think I'll kind of wrap up there. Like I said, I don't want to kind of over-determine the conversation at the beginning, but I'm really looking forward to all the conversations to come. And thank you again, everyone, for coming together today.
Thank you, Ian. I have one small question before we move on to the next part. I think for the looking at the visuals you've collected and these 3 points you're making, the politics of control, the conditions of labor, and the politics of vulnerability, I think the word you used most was abstraction. I think for the less tech savvy, or perhaps philosophically versed people who are listening in, could you run us through a little bit more what you mean by that abstraction on a concrete level? What's going on there that creates these conditions?
Yeah, so what I mean precisely when I use the word abstraction, in both cases, in the examples I'm using, it's a kind of numerical abstraction, right? And so we're used to the abstraction of price as being a kind of foundational abstraction for our societies. And what I mean by that is that in a capitalist kind of world, you can take any two things and assign prices to them, and they're abstracted through that price. We give them a number of value, and they become kind of equivalent in that situation, right? And so rather than rely on kind of qualitative distinctions where we talk about, for example, the value of an apple as opposed to the value of a human life or something like this, in which case there's kind of endless complexity in that kind of debate. In a quantitative distinction, you can certainly assign a price to an apple and certainly assign a price to a life. And this is done routinely all the time, right? And so this is a kind of foundational abstraction which structures economic life, social life, cultural life, and very much so in our present. And then on top of that, of course, is this new, well, relatively new kind of form of abstraction, which is the abstraction of data. That anything that you can kind of collect data on and kind of can allow for computers to process and analyze and exchange, that also is a kind of increasingly dominant form of abstraction in our society. And even though it's kind of often linked with price, so you think about Amazon, for example, as a kind of vast digital apparatus that mediates society based on kind of these online prices. It's not just contained to price. So you can imagine, for example, the monitoring of body temperatures at airports and in public spaces now in the pandemic as a form of abstraction through data that nonetheless kind of mediates the way that we interact socially and the way that state power is enacted. And so these are kind of two forms of abstraction, which I think are important.
The money aspect, and then there's the data aspect. And this, you mean the ways in which the lived experience is stripped of its detailed experience as such and turned into something that's controllable and quantifiable. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and I think most importantly is that there's an equivalency. So anything that you can collect data about, you can compare it to anything else you can collect data about. And I guess most importantly, in the context of the politics of control, is that this is kind of an automated process, that these forms of abstraction can be automated by machines, and that allows for this kind of automated forms of power and politics to take shape in a way that with qualitative distinctions, you can't quite do that.
All right, thanks for the clarification. We're going to chapter 2. The next speakers in this In this conversation, we'll have one present with a body and one with us channeling through. So Clara Balaguer, who is currently in Rotterdam, but from Makati City. She qualifies herself as a Pisces metal monkey and a cultural worker. From 2010 to 2018, she articulated cultural programming with rural and underserved communities in the Philippines through the Office of Culture and Design, which is a residency space and social practice platform. In 2015, she co-founded Hardworking, Good Looking, which are one word each, a cottage industry publishing house interested in horror vacui, thickening research on the post or decolonial vernacular, collectivizing authorship, and the value of the error. Currently, she coordinates the Social Practices Department at the Willem de Kooning Academy in Rotterdam, where I had the pleasure of being her colleague, and teaches experimental publishing at Piet Zwart Institute in Rotterdam. Frequently, she operates under collective or individual aliases that intimate her service in a given project, the latest of which is entitled To Be Determined. And for today, she has been collaborating with Czar Christoph, who is an artist based in the Philippines who works with photography, self-publishing, and collaborative gestures and text as an architectural form. His current practice, which sometimes requires public engagement, is based on his inquiries on memory, power, space, and body. His work has been exhibited at various institutions in Asia and Europe. In his last visit to the Netherlands, I had the pleasure of meeting him as well in The Hague. And Christoph is affiliated with Hardworking Good Looking. You'll recognize the name again, a publishing and a design house, interested in the same things as Clara, decolonization, horror vacui, tropical diaspora. In his most recent project, Temporary URL, Relearning Academy is an experimental school that focuses on co-autonomous learning in the Philippines. He lives and works in Laguna, Philippines. On behalf of both, I have the pleasure of handing the baton to Clara.
Hello. I shared a link in this Zoom chat to the transcripts of the conversation, this kind of liquefied conversation that Zara and I have had over the last few days. And I will just be reading kind of like a mashed up excerpts from there. So you can have the full one on the link. And I'm going to time it. So I have 10 minutes and I'm just going to be reading randomly through it. And meanwhile, I will also be showing a video. Hang on, let me just find it. Azar had made a video actually, and he sends his apologies to everybody. But yeah, internet speed in the Philippines is not with us today. So unfortunately, I will have to show you something else. I'll just pick, we were sharing a bunch of links with each other. So I'll just share one of the links. I'm looking through our links. And here we go. It's one of Zar's kind of interesting, yeah, anyway, it's about a guy surviving. Hang on, let me share the screen with you. I like that these things happen in real time as well, and that not everything is so prepared and manicured. I'm sharing my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen. Yeah.
Okay. And here we go. Hold on. Actually, Shailoh, I just realized that maybe it's better if you share this.
No problem. Then you can use your, otherwise we see everything.
Yeah. Otherwise you see everything. Yeah.
Sure. Pop me the link and I'll share it for you. No problem.
Okay, sure. Here you go.
So where are you taking us here on this? We're going to a rainforest, it looks like.
Yes. It's you can see the explanation in YouTube. They explain themselves better than I could.
All right.
It's just here. Okay. I'm
I'm
ready when you are.
turn off this. Share screen.
I do like to bring the real world and the error into things. Just so, I don't know, becomes a bit more of a natural texture to how these conversations actually happen. I can start reading. And I will start timing. Vernacular desktop research refers to the use of populist/popular online sources that are academically unenshrined. These sources include material built in common by unknown erudites, created outside of the confines of academic reliability, or circulated for free without the consent of gatekeepers to institutional access. This ongoing project is an exercise in redistributing abundance and a specific response to pandemic working conditions. By virtue of proximity and visibility, Clara is frequently called upon to participate in funded events in Europe as a freelance worker residing in the Netherlands. She shares these commissions with ZAR as a form of capital remittance in both material and immaterial terms, since much of the freelance work in the already underpaid Manila cultural sector has totally halted. This follows the convention of how families from the Philippines manage abundance in the case of members emigrating overseas for better working opportunities. The OFW, or Overseas Foreign Worker, is expected to remit a portion of their earnings to the family at home as support and in fulfillment of unspoken duties related to kinship. The Philippines has 11% of its population abroad, and OFW remittances account for 9.3% of the country's gross domestic product. I wasn't able to read the text completely because I received your email in the morning and I had to do domestic duties right away. Clara explains the premise, says she is not sure what the structure of the panel discussion is, doesn't know also what the fee is, but we will split evenly. Suggests they go through the premises one by one and try to understand how and whether they apply to their translocal context. What are the connections between these different locals? And how do we imagine or remember other locals? It is interesting to be reading a text like this, presenting the bigger picture, but I have to pause to go back to the space I am consuming at the moment. The text feels too big to occupy as a space, to occupy the space I am in. It is great to be exposed to ideas or methods that can probably change the world, but sometimes, maybe most of the time, it is a pity because the environment does not allow me or us to execute it, or we don't have enough power to do it, or we have other responsibilities. Sometimes, I don't know, it's a good diversion to read these texts, but domestic duties are also a diversion. Both have equal importance. The question of exhaustion. To act collectively is exhausting, as each individual is affected differently by what transpires within a collective space. In a disaster situation, survival trumps all other demands on energy. Here, it does not seem like the disaster is as grave, as citizens can still move freely from their homes. How can the same sense of urgency be manufactured when a veneer of normalcy exists, when suffering is not as palpable on street level? New society, or bagong lipunan. Marcos's autocratic projection of a modern Filipino society is a pretext for his dictatorship. To construct newness/progress at a time of crisis. This is the premise of any international aid program, and it is often the premise for dictatorial rule. I will bring you forward into modernity at the price of an imagined/stylized culprit's freedom. Crisis is a prime moment for indoctrination into an ideology, especially when that ideology's surplus is funding and infrastructure. Not all of us can choose how we live in relation to a crisis, to a pandemic, to believe that we can partake in a disaster as we see fit, instead of being totally overpowered by the crisis, the wave, the storm, the earthquake, the government policy, the systemic immobility. This may mean we are not in the eye of the upheaval. Idea of return, cycle. To destroy is to build. Random thought. I long for affection. Hands of Bresson, YouTube link. Book that I'm trying to read, intriguing from the description. Future Shock, Alvin Toffler, 1970, spread number 18, link to archive.org. I can't remember where I heard about this book. Modern society feeling shock for these changes relates to adaptation. Future shock. Transition. We are constantly afraid of birth, always being related to death. Recently in my family, we started being open about death. We casually talk about it now, unlike before. Relates to transition of accepting how limited time is. Privatized healthcare's defensibility is a common concern voiced most notably on mainstream media and academia by US citizens. In the Philippines, in Spain, and in the Netherlands, place of birth and life, other experience of nationality, current place of residence, universal healthcare exists. Its value is irrefutable. The critique of private healthcare is often followed by a critique of the prison industrial complex, also a prime US concern, considering that so much of its economy and social structure is built upon punitive and racialized capitalism. In a liberalist society, the natural conclusion of how to enact fearsome consequences on a deviant is the removal of liberty. In a theocratic society, perhaps the conclusion would be the ending of a deviant's life. When life or security is at risk, we are free to imagine, but perhaps not enact otherwise. The Philippines is a covert theocracy. There is a blurry to the point of insignificant line between autocratic and theocratic systems. They are one and the same, built upon the idea of a usually male protagonist/prophet whose divinity is revealed by the forbidding of critique against him. Discussions on domestic labor, emotional labor, care work, etc., without the performance of domesticity, without showing emotion, without demonstrating care. Policy removed from its object, subject, purpose. Resetting of rituals, work and pleasure, recalibration of the machine. Who operates the machine now? Rest from despair. Excerpt, Temptation Island, 1961. Walang tubig, walang pagkain, magsayawan na lang tayo. No water to drink, no food to eat. Let's just dance. YouTube link. Lol. DuckDuckGo search, Malthusianism. Curves of population versus lines of supply. Viral Malthusianism. In the post-disaster scenes of the Philippines where the rule of law is lax, citizens have reacted always in multiple ways, outside of only government-sanctioned programs. These ways are related to their deep-seated mistrust of governmental, organized power infrastructure. The government may not come to help you, but if it does, it will most probably be corrupted aid, siphoned off the top, emergency rice rations rotten, things repackaged so that the town mayor gets his pick of the relief goods and stocks the valuables in his office. This mistrust creates the need to act collectively, or the impulse, or the instinct, to act collectively and extra-officially. The rule of law is lax, but civil society is relatively active and healthy. Lijiki, instructional videos. Telenovelas with no plotline, just establishing shots that romanticize local folklore and craft. Government propaganda against rural to urban migration. Long-form infomercial for influencer merch. In Anglocentric and current pop portrayals of society in survival mode, the protagonist is a lone, white, and/or Western male fighting against the elements and speaking to a camera as he does so. Or a collective bickers amongst itself until one winner/survivor triumphs in the challenge. They often speak directly to camera, to an imagined public they must win to their side. In the portrayals of survival in the links below, the codes are different. Asian men, presumably of different Asian origins, fight for survival. It is a genre of videos, I think, inspired by the survival instinct guy who works individually, pensively, cinematographically, and in silence. The rest portray survival skills as a team, working synchronously and wearing almost the same clothes, if not the exact same clothes. No words are spoken. Similar differences apply to cooking show. In the West, they talk and talk and talk and talk while they cook or demonstrate survival. In the Philippines, we tend to follow the Western model of talk, talk, talk on TV. See Publishing as Bloodletting Act 1 for a disclaimer on why, from the non-West, which is not necessarily the East, we insist on identifying a West, not as a geographical place, but rather as a hyper-real concept. people who refuse to interface with the institution and other governing bodies for fear of co-optation, those who have had enough and have a choice to refuse. This refusal might not have any real effect on their life. Those who have had enough and have nothing left to lose. This refusal supposes a massive change, even a danger for their survival. Those whose identity is built upon opposition. This refusal is a form of pleasure and provides a sense of self. Performing care is a form of survival. Is survival a form of solidarity? And that's 10 minutes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So that's, yeah, me and Zara.
Yeah.
Having one of our conversations.
I'm not sure if I'm too mesmerized to think of a question. I guess I hear in what you're telling here is a way of countering what you call this broad space, this almost too broad space of sort of the way in which, I mean, Ian was talking about the totalizing nature of the virus, but there's also the totalizing nature of the narrative of
yes, and the task of change. I think, like when Zara and I were talking, like his life has shifted a lot because of the pandemic, and yeah, the reality in I think people who live in different countries, or like because their loved ones are in different places, you have this like sense of dislocation. It's like you're going through something here, but you know that over there it's a very different reality. So this I think what unites what our realities are very different, but we're both very exhausted with the task at hand. I think with Zara it's like just survival, taking care of the family, and yeah, making ends meet. And yeah, and like, what does his practice as an artist mean in that sense? How can he even practice? I mean, he's like, we were talking about how, like, even just this space to think, to sit down and think about the bigger picture is, yeah, it happens at night. It happens, yeah, we were working always from like 9 to like 1 in the morning. And for him, like, then he would have to go to market the next day at like 5 in the morning. So yeah, that's, it's exhausting to find time to think.
There's this, are you saying there's a certain amount of decadence to a grand narrative to this?
It's, I'm not sure if the word I would use is decadence. It's just a weight. I mean, yes, it is important to have a grand narrative and a strategy, but often, yeah, there is a weight. There is a real weight. I mean, in my case, it's more like this idea of, oh, let's reinvent education. And I'm like, what? I'm just trying to figure out how to work, Zoom, like, and I have to reinvent education. So it's this like,
it's the burden of the task at hand.
Yeah, and like this urgency of it is an urgent task, but then how can you reconcile the urgency of the task with the fact that you are finite? And how does collaboration become a form of deprivatizing? It's like our friend Sammy likes to say, deprivatizing the labor, and also as a way of giving each other this pause that is necessary to regain strength.
I was talking to Ian yesterday in preparation, and they were saying, this educational duties. I think we have some things to talk about there as well. The ways in which there's the care work of our ages also shift quite quickly in education as artists as well. Now, I have to resist the temptation to watch The Survival Instinct on YouTube.
Well, if you go through the crypt pad, like, there's a whole bunch of links. I would invite you to go down those rabbit holes.
Thank you for sharing those. We'll return to you in a moment. And I'd like to now introduce Matthijs for the chapter 3 of this. Matthijs is the fourth speaker. The third was Zar, speaking in conversation with Clara. And Matthijs, who I'll introduce, is someone with an artistic practice based in and part of political involvement. And as we were talking today in preparation for this conversation, he explained to me no longer working with labor unions, but in or within. So his work explores the relationship between economy, culture, and social life in order to achieve critical collective consciousness. During the last years, it's taken the form of collaborations with trade unions and other labor organizations, but with the nuance, then it's not really collaboration with, but actually working within. Between 2007, 2009, he traveled to China, collecting narratives of night dreams from migrant workers who had moved from the industrial centers from various parts of the country. And these interviews were a result of his collaboration with local activists and independent labor organizations. So today we welcome Matthijs, who will be speaking with us more about the dimension of labor and changing working conditions that we're involved with. Matthijs, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. I would like to talk about how we as artists can so I don't start with, let's say, my first crisis. It was during the 80s, the beginning of the 80s. It was a quite intense crisis at that moment, but I start with another one. That it was the crisis of Argentina in 2001. It started already a little bit earlier, you could say in the end of the 90s, but during 2001, you had the uprising and the whole economy collapsed during that year. I was living during that period in Argentina as an artist, and I also, well, you will try to work, of course, in this situation. But the most important thing what happened during that moment was that you as an artist become aware of the possibility to work in another way. Very simple, because during these days, all galleries, all museums were closed. So where can you work as an artist at that moment? I worked at that moment with a group of people who were working on the street called cartoneros, but I was not the only one who was working the other way. Also other artists at that moment started to work inside movements, inside during demonstrations, started to work with occupied factories and so on and so on. So the big question is, if you are in a crisis like we are in right now, how can we work? How can we act? That's a very important question. And of course, the question is always, how do we relate ourselves with institutions? That is also quite an important thing. Also a very practical thing, because at this moment, most of the institutions are closed. The universities are closed, the museums are closed, even Frame is closed at this moment. And also a very important question is, even during crisis, is if you are working with institutions, where does the money come from? It's a very important question, because this is really related to the question, for whom do I work? Now I go to, let's say, another crisis, and that's, let's say, the last economical crisis, what we had here in Europe, and it was during 2008, and well, it always an economical crisis takes a bit longer. So I'm going to step now into the 2010, and that was the moment that I started to work inside the trade union of the cleaners in the Netherlands. So it's called the FNV Schoon Genoeg movement at this moment. And I was looking already forward to, let's say, not to step out of the art world. It was more, you could more describe it as 1 foot inside, 1 foot outside. So I started to work, let's say, inside the trade union of the cleaners, but also at the same moment, I was still inside, let's say, the art world, you could say. But working in these two fields is quite interesting, because how do you work? Because you cannot use the same language. Now we are using a certain kind of language, and we hear many difficult words, but if I use this language inside a trade union, nobody will understand you and you cannot communicate at all. So an important question is, of course, the language you're using, not only the words, but also the visual language. So you have to use another language. And how do you create this? This is quite interesting, because if you're working inside a trade union, inside a democratic institution, and I'm sorry to tell you, but I don't consider the art world as very democratic. The trade unions are much more democratic. Even if I work inside a trade union, I have to present an idea and plan to, in my case, to the Parliament of the Cleaners, and they decide if they will do it, yes or no. So it's not the artist who makes a decision, is a democratic organization and parliament of workers who makes a decision. The good thing is of this that you can work much quicker, because if there's a democratic decision and everybody's following this, so everyone starts to contribute to a sort of kind of plan where you so this is a very interesting thing. Also, you could say that the decision making becomes more collective. And then we start directly to this interesting point of, let's say, how can you still work as an individual artist inside, let's say, in collective organization like in trade union? And in my experience, I have to say that is something that you know, these words of unlearning, de-learning are very fashionable. But in the case of working inside a trade union is reality. You have to unlearn certain kind of things. And I was talking already about the language, and but there are more issues you have to deal with. The good thing is that I also learned something very important, and especially during this crisis, very important. What you do as an artist is labor, and it's you know, being an artist is a job. And in the trade union, there's one thing completely forbidden, and that is free labor. Something what is completely normal inside the art world, but is outside, and if you go to another field, it's impossible to discuss. The few roles, the few fights I had in this trade union were about this, that I and another person who's the graphic designer started to do something, and they became angry, and he said, hey, you're not allowed to do this because first, it was not a democratic decision. B, there's no budget, so we cannot pay you. So these are very small things, what has a huge influence on your way of working, on your way of thinking. I told you already that I was working, let's say, with and for cleaners. And the main purpose of the trade union to invite an artist to work inside was the creation of a new identity. An identity, let's say, a visual identity, an identity of the Dutch worker of the 21st century. Because all we know, let's say, how the identity looks like of, let's say, the worker of the 20th century in Europe with the red flag and go on and go on. But where they were looking for, we have diverse group of workers. And what we need is an identity that we can unite them. Another group of workers who are working, who are organized inside this trade union of the cleaners are the domestic workers. We have been talking already about domestic labor right now, but these workers come from the Philippines, Indonesia, Brazil is a big group, Latin America. They are organized as undocumented workers inside the Union of Cleaners, inside the Netherlands. And for them, it's a different thing because it's very difficult to, when we are talking, let's say, how can you act during a crisis? For them, of course, they are now in an extremely difficult situation because they're undocumented. That means that they don't have any access to any support of the state. And because they are working in the private homes, nobody is willing to have them working inside their homes. So there's a huge problem at this moment going on. We're talking about a big group. We're talking about, the estimation is more or less 75,000 people in the Netherlands who are now without a real income. And if you talk about all the undocumented workers in the Netherlands, I think it's even more. This is a group in the Netherlands we don't talk about. They don't exist. If you compare it with the United States, an undocumented worker in the United States has more possibilities, more rights than in the Netherlands, for example. When I quickly go back to the cleaners, because now we are in the crisis of the corona of 2020, their problems right now are more connected with working in unsafe conditions. That's a huge problem at this moment. The other problem is that their bosses, they are demanding to take vacation days. That is another problem, because if there's no work, companies try to, and this is not only in, let's say, for the cleaners the case, but in more fields, we have this problem that bosses ask the workers to take vacation days so they don't have to pay that much income. And then I want to pay attention also to another problem what we have, because I'm talking about labor right now, 2020 in the Netherlands, and that is the huge problem what we have with the workers from Eastern Europe. These people are working for employment agencies, for distribution, and or in the food industry. You can think about the meat industry, but also like the asparagus. I don't know how it is in English.
Asparagus.
Yes, that is in people from Romania, Hungary, and so on. One of the problems is that they are living together in small houses or in caserns and so on. And when they are working, they cannot have this 1.5 meter distance. So yesterday it was in the news already that there is a new outbreak of the corona in Germany, also linked with workers from Eastern Germany, Eastern Europe, working inside the meat industry. And so there you see, let's say, in effect, everything looks fine always in the Netherlands. So that we are really good with this. So in fact, our death rate is still higher than the United States. Nobody knows this abroad, but we have more deaths in the Netherlands than in the United States at this moment. But the Netherlands are always really handy to smooth things. For example, our death rate is very low because we don't test. And if you are not tested, you're not an official death in the corona person in the Netherlands. So all the people who are dying at this moment in the elderly homes, like everywhere else in Europe, they are not considered as official corona deaths. So in fact, our rate is now about around 6,000. But I think altogether, I think you have to double this rate without any problem. Now I'm going to the step, let's say, take this step after the crisis, because we are talking already today about how the situation of artists will be after the crisis in the Netherlands. Well, I think we have to be realistic. It will be bad because during, let's say, the crisis of 2008, the result was a restructuring of the culture in the Netherlands, and the art world was not very effective in their protests. Nowadays, it's even worse because we are completely invisible. We cannot even strike because everything is closed already. So what can we do? How can we organize? And there, I think, is a very important question for the next months, because we are more or less in this moment of, we can think about what we would like to end, what we can end, but then we talk about something what we can end, this will be ended, we will fly, be a bit less, but is this also a possibility? And that is a big question. What is probable? what is possible. This difference, I think Bethel was already talking about this in his last article. And I think this is quite interesting because on one hand, we can think about, okay, we can go to a more green society, we can go to an anti-capitalistic society, but in the meanwhile, and that we have to be aware of this, other people also already making plans nowadays, and people who are more closer to the power than we are. And we have to be aware of this, I think. So how to create solidarity at this moment is also a very important thing, because we always think that solidarity is something what comes something out of our body. Well, the moments when we had solidarity, let's say before the 80s in Europe, this was an organized solidarity. It was organized by the trade unions, by the Communist Party, by the Social Democratic parties. And so it was not something what came out of the people. It was something what is organized. Even if you talk about anti-racism, were the workers before the 80s completely anti-racist? No, it was the Communist Party, it was the trade union who told them to be racist is something wrong. So this was the main reason. Yeah, okay, I'm talking about it more than 10 minutes.
Yes, and we have a question for you.
Okay,
the question is coming in from YouTube. The question is, so if if there's not testing in the Netherlands, how do you know that the death rate of COVID-19 people are so high? How do we know that?
There's a statistics called the CBS, that is the Central Office of Statistics in the Netherlands, and they were counting how many people were dying last year. So what is the normal death rate every year? So they took the last 5 years, and then they looked to saying the death rate at this moment. So, and in the weeks, the top weeks, we talk about, let's say the first week of April, for example, the death rate was 2,000 higher than it was last year. And then, you know, of course, you don't know if all the deaths are related with the corona, but then you know, hey, something is wrong here. Yeah. So the official death rate is not the real death rate.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying, Matthijs, is looking at these different chapters. One is recalibrating our relationship as artists in the time, and the other is looking at the different labor conditions and people working in. I thought it was interesting what you said about how free labor is expected of artists. And I thought it was interesting also the question, who do we work for?
Yes.
And I'd like to pose that question back to our other speakers. If you were to answer that question for yourself in these times, there's the official and the unofficial. Who do we work for? Or what do we work for? I'm curious for Ian and for Clara, how would you respond to this question of labor in our times?
Do you want to go first, Clara?
No, you can go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Welcome back.
You spoke first, so you can go.
I mean, I suppose I speak kind of from an anarchist political position, and for me, like in this moment, one of the more kind of interesting, novel things about it is the possibilities that it presents for being opposed to kind of the logic of work in general. This idea that we're kind of tied to the wage or tied to salary as a form of kind of survival is certainly something that kind of dominates the capitalist social relation. And so the notion that we can kind of abolish the category of work in favor of other forms of kind of distribution of goods and kind of forms of kind of infrastructure that don't necessarily rely upon this idea of the wage. I mean, this is something that we live in a moment where, you know, like the logic of capitalism is totally falling apart. Like markets can no longer really reproduce themselves, and governments are stepping in to kind of simulate markets with zero interest loans and with kind of stimulus payments. And we see universal basic income appearing in different contexts. And so I think the hope is that once the pandemic passes, you know, we'll be able to kind of go back to normal. And so from my own perspective, at least, I think of this less as a kind of labor struggle in terms of thinking about this like within the history of kind of worker struggle, et cetera, and think about this more as like a opportunity to even question the relation of work as a category that organizes our societies.
Clara? Clara?
I guess I'm thinking that the Philippines being in the ring of fire, it's like this area wherein we have earthquakes, typhoons. So we have fault lines, earthquakes. We have fault lines, earthquakes, typhoons, something else, volcanoes, and political instability. So it's like we are in a constant state of disaster and recovery, and disaster and recovery. And I think labor in a disaster, post-disaster environment becomes necessary for mental survival, even just occupation. So this idea of free labor doesn't quite hold sometimes. And when you talk about like a place where government structures are unreliable, completely, yeah, we just don't trust that they will come to our aid. So kinship ties become fundamental in surviving and in filling the gaps of what institutions are too weak or maybe just too overwhelmed to provide. So definitely I resonate with this idea of profits or use value of the worker not being, it's always applicable in a situation where you have a total disaster. To be able to refuse free labor is, yeah, sometimes you have indentured labor, you work for exchange. I don't know, I guess I'm thinking, I don't want to speculate too much. I don't know what's going to happen. Like this is, yeah, even though we have a crisis muscle and a disaster muscle coming from somewhere like the Philippines, this is beyond our imagination, I think. And I find myself kind of more trying to see what I can learn from other crises that I've experienced, witnessed, maybe directly, maybe indirectly, maybe a month after. But yes, just this, the time of this kind of disaster has a timeline that is unknowable. And I think what grounds me are these human relationships and understanding that, yeah, that these kinship relationships are perhaps the most valuable form of exchanging labor.
What do you mean by kinship?
Kinship meaning like I mean, when you talk about like kinship politics, it's like your kin can be your family, or it can be, in the Philippines we talk about, I mean, sorry, I just talk a lot about the Philippines because it's what I know, and I find it useful to navigate through these concepts from a landscape which I know. In the Philippines we have this concept called the barangay. So the barangay is like a borough, but it comes from the word balangay. Balangay was a boat. It was a large boat where groups of families traveled together, and that was your kin. So not necessarily bloods, but more proximity. Proximity related can be geographical proximity and can be also structures of debt. Like in a kinship ties mean their kinship ties are structured by the idea of debt. What I owe you because you have done something for me, or you have, yeah. So this this idea of debt in a non-economic sense that can be repaid in an economic sense, but we call it debt from the inside, utang na loob. So when I talk of kinship, it's also these structures of not just filial relationships, but need and I don't know what the word is, but yeah.
Or maybe care. We have a question that's directly related to this that I will, if I may, riff off of you, and then we're going to move to these 10 premises. So jumping to premise 7 in this 10 premises, we have a question that said, it's speaking of kinship, do you consider caring as a radical act or a form of protest in the pandemic? Who would like to take this? Caring, to what extent can we think of caring as a response?
I think caring can be very radical. I mean, and also like what we mean when we say care, or what we imagine, like care is often frameworked or like put forth as this like feminized, gentle, maternal act, when care can also be aggressive. To protect, sometimes you must be aggressive. So it can be radical to be tender. What was the question? Was it a radical act, or was it? It depends on the context.
If it would be considered as a radical act or even as a form of protest.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can have like aggressive care, like if you think of protest also, or radicality as some sort of, mask sort of taking and conquering, then yes, but it can also like tenderness and a gentle approach, and that can also be extremely radical, depending on it's the context that dictates whether it is radical or not. If care is practiced, then it's not radical, it's just a reality. So depends on how much uncaring is around you, I suppose.
Well, in my immediate environment here, I have some very loud neighborhood kids. So speaking of locality, if you hear screaming or skateboards on this live stream, everyone's cool. It's just playing in the sun, I hope here. I want to open up the opportunity for Matthijs and Ian and Clara all to see after this first round if there's something in particular that you'd like to highlight as we go into the 10 premises. Is there something that will be on your mind in particular as we go to chapter 2, which is going through the premises one by one? Matthijs.
I would like to say something about the last question because it's quite interesting. I think you should turn it around and you should say more, no care is a radical act. And I think this is more present nowadays, especially, for example, we had in Europe, we had the problems that the northern countries don't care what is going on in the south. And I think you should consider this as a very radical act, but very negative, of course. So I think taking care of somebody else is something more, I would say this is something normal. This is not militant, this is not radical, this is what we should do. And I think if you don't do it, that is, I think, a radical and act, a militant act.
So when you say radical and militant, you're using this as a negative or as a derogatory term, then you're saying not caring or apathy or not getting involved is the radical, and care is the normal. You'd like to reframe the normal. Okay, thank you. Ian, anything you'd like us to take in our basket as we?
I mean, I can just respond to the question of care as well, since it seems to be somewhat orienting discussion now. I mean, for me, the way I think about care is always about the distribution of care, and so thinking it not as like an individual responsibility or something that we take on as a kind of something that is kind of privatized to our own lives, but rather as a kind of inherently collective and social phenomenon. And this is like largely, I think, how capitalism and liberal society reproduces itself by kind of excluding care from the kind of calculation. And so this is why, domestic labor is most often performed by women. This is why so much of kind of how we think about the distribution of care is mediated by supply and demand and these other kinds of logics that are kind of indifferent to human life. And so I agree with what Clara said, that this is also, it's like an incredibly ideological concept, right? That we typically think of care as this kind of like tender, feminized kind of labor. But of course, I think part of politicizing care is in thinking about kind of militant politics. And, we can think about not only people that are delivering groceries to people during the pandemic and all this kind of stuff, but people that are, for example, intervening when police try to arrest people in the street, or blocking kind of deportations, and this kind of action also as a kind of necessary form of care in this moment. And so I think that's precisely kind of the stakes of the present situation, is how we imagine care, and more importantly, how we imagine the kind of distribution and enactment of it.
As a last note, I ran across this formula for what care work is. That I don't know if this is, it was in a paper about like nursing, I believe. And it was care work equals emotional labor plus physical labor plus organizational labor. And for some reason, I found this, like the distinction between care work and like what is the actual like practical definition of care work in economic terms, and I found this useful. I don't know if it's the right definition, but I did find it a useful kind of boundary.
One of the things it does highlight is the unpaid dimension, or underpaid.
Yes.
Care work. Yeah.
Yes.
I suggest now we move to these 10 premises, starting with number 1. So the way I did this is I made for myself a cheat sheet. Number 1 shorthand for me is the virus is social. So the way you formulated this, Ian, was a pandemic isn't a collection of viruses, but is a social relation among people mediated by viruses. Let's start here. What does it mean to say that the virus would be social?
Hang on.
I mean,
I'm just scrolling through my notes. Hang on.
Yeah, I'll play it back to you first. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just about to say, I'm not sure I should be the one to begin, just because I wrote these, so I obviously have my opinion on them. But I mean, the reason I started the text this way was explicitly to kind of insist upon the necessity of denaturalizing the pandemic, and kind of refusing to think that this is something that simply happens to us, but something that we participate in. And I think that's, it's a simple gesture, but I think that's the first step towards politicizing things, is to understand that we're not simply kind of, victims of history, and we're not simply kind of here receiving everything that's happening around us, but rather that we actively participate in these processes, and to understand that as a kind of ethical imperative, that we actually have a responsibility to determine the direction of these things. And so that's certainly not only true of the pandemic.
Sorry, when you say politicizing things, you mean highlighting our responsibility in that, or what I guess the question, what do you mean by politicizing?
I mean it in two senses. In the first sense, I think I mean it that when we politicize something, we declare that we have a particular stake in it, and so we understand that not only do we have a responsibility to it, but that we actually depend on it in a particular way for our ways of life, and in the second way, to acknowledge that this is a situation that we share with people that are different than us. And so to understand that the ways in which we navigate this necessarily implies organizing with and fighting with people that are different with us in the world. And so it's kind of, on the one hand, goes back to what I was saying at the beginning around this being a kind of collective and differential situation. I think that's what I was trying to communicate with this idea of the pandemic being a social relation.
Yeah. Thanks, Clara.
I think I'd like the first part of what I read earlier was kind of in response to this, and like this idea of choosing to partake was perhaps what's stuck in our conversation with like to what point when something overwhelms you, because yeah, in some places the condition is overwhelming. So to what points when you feel overwhelmed can you actually partake? And I think there is like to identify within our, like if we are to act collectively, like to identify what the energy levels are of everybody and who can partake, I think is also an important discussion. So to not make this like another overwhelming obligation. And it's if we partake, like, to what level are we expected, and can those who are able, for those who are able for the moment, like, they will have to step in for those who are not, and how to have the voice of those who are not, or the plight or the pain of those who are not, constantly within this conversation of those who can partake, which is us.
Mm-hmm. And this is something I also heard you saying, Matthijs, when you were talking about your work with the cleaning trade union. You said this is also an issue of language, right? Where there's also partaking in a certain way of being able to talk about this. And I was wondering, even saying the virus is social requires a certain degree of abstraction in itself, perhaps, to be able to think, okay, what does that even mean? I was wondering, in your experience, Matthijs, in this, is this way of framing the whole situation we're in as a social phenomenon, is that something that translates to this context in your experience?
Now, it's quite clear that this virus is social from the beginning on. I think this is the main result. The political, I think if you connect it with politics nowadays, I would also like to mention this whole idea of personal responsibility. And this element of personal responsibility is something what, especially in the Netherlands and and the UK, is a very present in official politics. So in the Netherlands, you have this whole idea of, they have the frame of samen, so together. Only together we can solve it. That means if it goes wrong, it's our problem. And it's not anymore let's say, the problem of a government who made some mistakes. So what the politics in the Netherlands and the UK are doing is, and I think Owen Jones wrote, I think today or yesterday, a very good article about this in The Guardian. He says really, he said, the strategy at this moment is personal responsibility. And he was talking something about good and solid British common sense or something like this. This is the official politics. So if something goes wrong, we cannot blame anymore the government, because we are responsible ourselves, because we were not respecting the 1.5 meter distance, for example. We are visiting our parents and so on. This is a very tricky thing. If you talk today about, let's say, the cleaners, I think is quite clear. So there are so many situations that people who still work in public spaces, they cannot take care, they cannot take, let's say, a distance of 1.5 meters. So when something happens, still they can blame them.
So what I hear you saying then is, in saying the virus is social, there's this danger of victim blaming in a way.
Yeah.
There's a danger of perhaps saying, oh, if it's social, then it's the individual responsibility, and perhaps that's actually a greater burden.
Yeah, but I think that's not what Ian was talking about.
No, but
it's completely, it has another point of interest, but it's more, I'm talking, hey, watch out, because this, the social thing is also a very tricky thing to, well, first, I think the government at this moment has to take responsibility. And in the Netherlands and in the UK, they made huge mistakes. There were not enough masks, there were not enough beds, they were starting this lockdown too late, and this caused a lot of problems. So, and then how can you get rid of this responsibility is to create, let's say, in the Netherlands, the word samen, together, or in the, they say in the UK, this personal responsibility. These are tricks in order to, let's say, to govern in a very clever way.
Yeah, and how they play up on like some sort of local cultural trait. Like in the Philippines, it was our resilience, which is, coming from our natural cheerfulness. And it's indeed like a way of offloading responsibility onto the citizens. In our case, this idea of resilience, like where we smile through disaster. So it becomes It's a very kind of subtle and clever way to play upon nationalistic traits, like nationalistic pride traits, in order for the citizens to assume responsibility for what is indeed a mistake of the government. And it's tricky how they do it, tricksy how they do it in each country.
Let's move to the second one. This one I've premise 2 I have shorthanded as the virus as an opportunity. This points to, in Ian's words, at the very least, the expanding suspension of social, economic, and political norms and laws provides each of us with a unique opportunity to question the pre-pandemic world we had all grown accustomed to living within. In other words, the lava of this moment, where things that you thought were so solid all of a sudden become liquid, points as an opportunity. And what I felt that Clara, your presentation, in some ways, in your collaboration with Zar, really points out to the ways in which this let's say perhaps this logic of opportunity is itself also quite indicative of a very particular type of, let's say, progress paradigm. Did I pick up on that correctly?
I guess like what we did, it wasn't really that we changed something in our way of working. It was just enhancing it, like this form of redistribution that we've had, and not just like, you know, from me to like back home, but also something that people have done with me. So this constant living in a state of, and I say precarity in my case in quotation marks, because yeah, I've got roof over my head and food in my mouth, and I always have. But yeah, living in this peripheral state, or this kind of the constant beck and call of precarity, means you naturally just work in certain ways. So this crisis was just like a ramping up of something that was already happening. So there was this latent knowledge of how to deal with a little bit with how to deal with some of the aftermath. It's what I've been realizing. It's a crisis muscle.
I think this term of a crisis muscle is quite interesting. I'm more familiar with kind of the opposite story, which is, let's say, Naomi Klein and the shock doctrine, which is when there's a crisis, watch out for various forms of propaganda and exploitation that are kind of shelved till the moment that people are distracted by disaster, and then will be like parachuted into a thing. So I'm what you're saying seems to be the opposite. It's like, you develop some sort of muscle memory.
To survive, yes. To thrive, or to prosper, or to enact systemic change, no. But to survive, yes. And I think maybe we are in I don't know, it's impossible to tell the future, but maybe just the act of survival in itself will become just the ability to survive despite vulnerability will be just as important. Like, we need to survive in order to be able to, you know, have the headspace. Like, we have to weather the immediate aftermath, and then we'll talk. So I guess this crisis muscle that I'm talking about is to survive rather than to be sustainable. So yeah, survivability, which is, I feel like a broken record, but I always say this. It's like, for me, the concern is usually survivability and not sustainability, because we know that the situation is unsustainable, and yet we have to survive.
I mean, I think for me, what orients so much of my thinking about this is like this idea around survivability for me kind of goes back to this idea of like necessity, like what is actually required, like what is the baseline, right? And under like quote unquote normal times, there's a whole set of kind of social ideas and political ideas that we're told are like absolutely necessary, you know? The prisons are like a classic example of this, and like conversation of abolition, that the prison occupies this kind of category of a necessity for most people, right? This idea that there's no possible way to organize a society without incarceration, for example. The market economy is another one of these, right? That without capitalism, there can be no possible way to kind of materially reproduce society, et cetera, right? And what we find in crisis, and this is maybe kind of what defines crisis, is all these things like that we thought were necessary become suspended just kind of arbitrarily, right? Like, well, we need the market economy. Well, actually, we can just kind of like print money, right? Or we need prisons, but then, oh, there's this virus, like we can actually like empty half the prison, no problem, right? And so there's this like way in which what appeared as permanent and unchanging and necessary for life and for ways of living appear suddenly at the level of perception as arbitrary and as historical and as artificial. And this is what I was trying to get at with this word opportunity, that I think very popularly, like across the entire world right now, there's this real kind of realization that things are really up in the air. And rather than feel like that this is the role of states to kind of decide how to kind of implement various kinds of emergency measures to get to the other side of the pandemic, we should also, I feel like, take that task on ourselves to understand, like, if these things are arbitrary, what kinds of things are we interested in suspending and creating in this moment? And I think, you know, as artists, it's interesting to kind of approach this from the perspective of the artist, because I think this really does happen at the level of perception, this idea of like how we perceive and understand the world. And it's not even necessarily like an intellectual project. I think it's literally about how we sense the world around us from all these different places. And I think that approaching it from the point of view of perspective, I think is really interesting, because it allows us to have a conversation where people in radically different contexts that live very, very different lives and embody all different kinds of difference can nonetheless kind of come to share various forms of perception of our collective situation. And so I think that is kind of what's at stake.
Let's talk about perception. Let's talk about the role of the artist in this. I think this is not on the 10, and I think it is a good time to insert it, right? I found that interesting, Ian, that even as an artist, I didn't see the artist mentioned in these premises, right? Matthijs, you were.
God.
What do you mean, Clara? Yeah.
I mean, it was in our conversation with Zara as well, where Zara was talking with another friend of ours, Alfred, who is on YouTube. And he and Alfred were talking about, like, yeah, what role does what they do have, like, you know, these more kind of, yeah, like what's, how can the cultural, I mean, the world of cultural production also come to terms with its non-essential nature, because, yeah, although it is, yeah, frightening to think of, like, you know, severe cultural funding cuts here in the Netherlands, because it is like a, you know, the cultural world depends on it. Where we're from, these funds don't exist, so it's like a moot point. How do we handle our non-essential nature, and somehow become, and this I know is controversial, but not everybody needs to do this, but yes, somehow become vital in some ways to whatever communities we can be in touch with. It's a difficult question that I've been asking myself for the last 10-12 years. So yeah, what then becomes the role of an elite cultural production when the priorities have radically shifted? I think is the difficult question to be discussed, especially in places where cultural funding is available.
Matthijs, I think you might have something to say about this.
Well, I see. Well, as an artist, you have many possibilities. At this moment, I think maybe a good example has been in the last, I think, 2 years in the Netherlands, the group of artists who has been working with the issue of the sponsorship of Shell with the Van Gogh Museum. So they were not willing to show their work inside the Van Gogh, but they were making actions, performances, other activities outside the museum in order to protest against Shell as a sponsor of Van Gogh Museum. And finally, they won. So this is a really interesting thing. I was surprised that it went so quick. So it is possible for artists, if you connect yourself with other movements, to have an important role in a society. I think personally, if you stay, let's say, with your left-wing thoughts inside institutions like the big museums or even galleries, is even worse, then forget it. This doesn't make any sense anymore. And this is completely, I think, this is a joke, I would say. But the moment if you literally go outside the museum and start to work there as an artist, you can be very effective still.
So, so what you're saying is, let's take away the frame of the cultural field as being exclusive, walled-off space, and position art in the everyday, in work, in labor, in. Now, there has always been, not always, perhaps always, there's been a recurrent theme of artists to do this anyhow.
Yes, but I think in the case of the Colorado with the Van Gogh Museum, they have been very, you could say, well, it is very simple what you can do is, but the moment I think if they could also having their own career inside, let's say, the cultural institutions, because the question is always for whom do you work? And in this case, if you talk about the Van Gogh Museum with the sponsorship of Shell, I think the answer is clear. Culture there is functioning. Let's say,
greenwashing, they say.
Yes. Yeah. So I think, and they were showing this in a very clever, simple way, and they won. So it is, and of course, it's not always, it has to be a struggle or a fight or somehow. But the moment if you, let's say, the art world can be bigger than, let's say, our career planning to end up in a museum or in a gallery, then we have so much possibilities.
Well, but if I may interrupt, there is a degree. I mean, there's this saying: the problem with the rat race is, even if you win, you're still a rat, right? So there's this way which, even if you, let's say, you win within a certain logic, we're still in the field. There's still precarity. There's still bills to pay. There's still the question of how do we survive, right?
Yeah, especially if you want to become an artist working for museums, then you will stay a precarious worker, for sure.
How do you navigate this field, Ian?
I mean, I think for me, the radical position, like in this conversation around like work and around the artist. I mean, the reason that the artist doesn't appear like in this text, and the reason like the category of worker doesn't really appear as like a subject of liberation in the text for the same reason, is that I think part of the task at hand is actually kind of abolishing these kinds of categories. That like this idea that there are some of us that are artists and we produce culture, and the rest of society is not an artist and consumes culture, or the idea that some of us are workers and produce society and reproduce society, and those without jobs do not work. This is like I think constitutive of many of the problems we face. And so certainly we all kind of fight from where we are. Like, you know, if you're in a university, you fight within a university context. If you're a worker, you fight within the context you find yourself within. I mean, I think that's like a practical necessity in a way. But I think the object of those projects of resistance always have to be about this kind of abolition of those categories, about, you know, the worker struggle is about abolishing the kind of category of worker as somehow.
So with the collapse of art as a market, you will not be one of the mourners.
As a market? Yeah, no, as someone, yeah, I absolutely do not worry about this. The same with kind of state-funded culture. I mean, I think, again, it's like unapologetically like a utopian radical position, I think. But I think that when we're talking about a situation like the pandemic, I think this has to at least orient what we're thinking about really trying to kind of explode these categories, and rather than understand ourselves as having like very particular subjective uses, trying to like really free that idea of use up and think about all the different ways we can be useful in society that isn't necessarily determined by our subject position.
Right. One of the things that I appreciate about your contribution today, Clara, is the ways in which there's nothing speculative about your position on labor in this talk, right? It's not like, oh, then maybe it's. I think it's interesting to think through both the utopian of how could it be different, rethinking that. At the same time, you're saying, okay, I'm sharing my fee, and that is itself a here and now, something you can do here and now.
Yes, I feel like we're still, or at least I am still in this moment of digestion, of understanding what's happening, what this means, and like anticipation also, because there are guidelines that we need to follow, that we need to enact for the coming months. There is the task to reimagine certain things. So right now, I think I'm still in this. I mean, talking about the crisis muscle, the first thing that you learn is that step number one is data gathering. You need baseline data. You need to understand what's going on. So I feel like I'm in a moment of just gathering data and reactiveness, and still just trying to rebuild, make a little campsite. Essentially, and that is where I am at. So when you're in a tent, you're reacting to the moment and finding the strategies for the moment.
You bring this river that you showed when you say campsite.
Yes. I mean, and you might notice some of this language that I'm using because I have been using it at work as well.
Yeah.
This idea of, there are frontline tasks to take care of. I mean, we're not frontliners, we're not healthcare workers, but I think in the in education, we are just behind the frontliners. Like among the first things to reopen will be schools. And we are, kind of keeping, we are minding, I mean, not in our case, because we're teaching tertiary education, but the minding of the children, while the parents have to go and do the work and bring in the sustenance to pay the rent. That is also a sort of essential, secondary level essential task, I would say.
Yeah, as long as there's work.
Yes, so I'm trying not to be super speculative, because I'm overwhelmed by this need to reinvent society, and it's squarely placed on the shoulders of those who are on the ground. I find that the solution in my case, or solution or way forward, it often happens, or an idea often comes by doing. So just in enacting these small ways, then it's prototyping in a way. Okay, how could it work? Well, what about this? Does this profit sharing system work? Does this so I'm just in this kind of slowly enacting certain things and seeing what sticks and then going there. But definitely a process that happens in motion. So rather than speculate, I prefer to prototype.
In your response, we've jumped from premise 3 to 9 and 10. And I suggest we follow you on that jump, and we can go back in a minute. So premise 9 and 10 are about new modes of struggle. So because the life in the pandemic is the way it is, life in the pandemic will not stay the way it is. This is about sort of if I understand correctly, this moment where we need to sort of recalibrate. And coming back to what you said at the very beginning, Ian, this relates to the question of what's new and what is, let's say, more a continuity, and looking at the now not necessarily as a continuity with the future as well. So this sort of unstable moment. And what I hear you saying, Clara, here is, all right, hang on. Let's hang on here for a moment and figure out what's going on. And 10, premise 10, linked to this is, okay, what new ways of living do we desire then? What do we want, right? So what you're suggesting is, let's take this time to figure that out. Is that okay to paraphrase it that way?
Yeah, I mean, take the time. There is no time to take. That's the thing, is you must act. So it's like you have to think, and it's like, you know, you're rubbing your stomach in one way and rubbing your head in the other way and trying to get in that rhythm and just be like, okay, I have to do two things at the same time. So I think it's, yeah, finding that space, somehow extruding the 24 hours in the day and trying to find space to think and act at the same time is, for me, the task at hand, which I struggle with, as you know. But there is no kind of, I keep thinking about this a quote from another friend, Renan Laruan. He's a curator from the Philippines, and he had this beautiful text about, he said, the only knowable time of disaster, the only knowable time of the periphery is emergency. So I've just been like, this thing has been like kind of moving in my head, like there is a temporal element to emergency.
Can you repeat that slowly? My brain is
kind of like he was describing the peripherical condition, and then he said something that was like, the only knowable time of the periphery is emergency. It's only the, yeah, and the temporal kind of collapsing of time when you're in a crisis is yeah, something that you have to, that you, this physical experience of time collapsing, and is, I don't know.
Emergency calls for now, this quick panic, right?
Yes, and when you live in a periphery, so not in the center where there's resources, whatever, then you know your constant time is emergency. You're constantly like out of breath and trying to relocate to one place and another. Like it's all about, yeah, reactiveness. And yeah, the way that I experience time now is very different. And as you were saying, I'm not speculating. I'm completely just trying to live this moment and unable to speculate, though that is the task at hand.
Can you bear with us for a moment while we do speculate?
Yes, absolutely. This is like.
And Ian, I'd like to invite you both in response to these 9 and 10 as we look forward. Like the future is unknown right now, but this question of what do we desire? In 9 it says, you know, it won't stay this way. What are the things of sort of sifting through this? What are the things that you think we should, let's say, keep and carry with us, or introduce as an opportunity when it comes to what ways of living do we desire? What, if you could, let's say, suggest things that we take with us into the future, what would you suggest?
For me, like 9 and 10 are oriented around 2 ideas. The first idea, I mean, around this idea of time, it's very interesting because I think, like, rather than crisis being about the suspension of time, for me, I think it's precisely when time actually appears, like when we actually experience time. Outside of crisis, I think we live as if like things aren't going to change, like that we kind of live our life according to particular kinds of norms and expectations around kind of what is happening in our societies and in the world. And we live, you know, along the fantasy that, you know, I can have a retirement account and I can try to buy a house and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In a time when this is like clearly fantasy, right? I mean, we live in the era of climate change was already kind of reorienting like our political horizon in a way, and the pandemic has done so, you know, kind of unexpectedly. But in a way, like we're living these kinds of transformations. Like we can't, this idea that society can just stay the same is just kind of like materially untrue at this point, right? Like we're headed towards like vast catastrophe. And so like we're kind of living that catastrophe, and crisis is a way of kind of punctuating that experience in a way. The second thing about kind of speculation, I mean, I think speculation is an incredibly important category for projects of resistance in general, just because I think starting from the point that we don't know whether things will work is really important politically, like that kind of agnosticism that we can't like just declare a political program, for example, and say this will be the path to victory. I think that's a very kind of ethical, important kind of ethical foundation for projects of resistance. But second of all, I mean, just a very practical fact that if we knew what would work, like how could we, dismantle capitalism, et cetera, we would have already done it, right? I mean, like if it were that easy, just following steps, the project would have already been undertaken. And so starting from that kind of ignorance that we don't actually know what works, I think is the very kind of first step or phase in thinking about resistance. But that second of all, like resistance is a transformative process, right? That we aren't just kind of like knowing subjects that we enter into a project of resistance and kind of act upon the world, but rather like we fundamentally change, I think, like when we engage in resistance, and it's a kind of mutually transformative process for everyone involved. And so we're kind of at this point where we can't even like articulate what we desire necessarily, because those desires themselves will transform as we kind of interact with other people and enter into new kinds of relations, and as our kind of interdependencies shift and all this kind of stuff. And so I think in all of those senses, I always think about resistance as radically speculative in the sense that it's about kind of wagering that through the project of resistance, liberation is possible without necessarily even being able to describe the object in that moment.
Matthijs.
When I think about the 9 and 10, I would say, yeah, in this moment, I think, well, what Ian wrote, I think it's an opportunity at this moment. It's a time that is asking questions, but I think the answers has to be collective. And in order to be collective, you have to get organized. I think this is a very important thing. We can talk hours and hours how we would like to create a new society, but the moment if you're not organized, you never will get there.
And how would you, drawing from your experience, you say organized, how would you imagine that working in these times? What are the challenges or things we need to grapple with?
Well, first of all, I think at this moment it's very interesting to see that young people in the Netherlands, they notice the same thing, that it will not be anymore the same like it used to be, and it will change completely. And they are quite afraid of that it will going in an even more unequal way than before, and even let's say to a life with even more depths than before. So the amount of young workers who are connecting at this moment with the trade unions, that's incredible. That's really a surprise of the last month in the Netherlands, that it was always so difficult to get young people connected with trade unions, and now they come by themselves, because there is already unconsciousness growing, especially in the working class, that they say, hey, the last crisis, we pay them. We paid the last crisis, and they know already, I think, the state is making huge debts at this moment, and who will pay these debts? And they will think, okay, not again.
But do you see in that movement of, let's say, young people joining trade unions also any seeds for a different logic, which, as Ian said in the fourth premise, testifies to a way of organizing life beyond price, competition, and profit? Is there an aspect of that that's also about wanting a different?
Yeah, but that's maybe the biggest and the most difficult thing to achieve. I think, can we change our way of thinking? We have so much, let's say, neoliberalism in our veins. We all five have this in our veins. If we think how we would like to live and so on, and how can we get rid of that and to think in another way. And if we can achieve this step together with other people, then you can think about starting another kind of society. So we also have to get rid of our own neoliberalism in our own head.
Can you give an example of this, the way in which you're imbued with neoliberalism?
Okay, it's not so difficult. We are in the art world. What is the most important thing in the art world? Competition. Mm. So I think competition, being precarious worker, all these kind of things, we think this is normal. And if you have, well, if you lived in another society, I think say, hey, but this is not normal. So you can also work together. Why have you compete with your colleague all the time?
I think there are other sectors of the art world that do kind of refuse this already. So, I mean, yeah, but I do agree. And when I say like, I'm not trying to be speculative, it means, I guess like, when I think about speculation, it's just this idea of things being on the drawing board and like describing the issue and re-describing it and kind of, you know, for me, it's more about enacting things and starting like keeping in motion. And enacting things, indeed, like organizing in a larger sense, like change does not come through individual efforts, but there is something to be said, I guess, about action, speculation. I mean, yeah, speculation being useful, but to not let speculation turn into paralysis. And to move and to do and to make mistakes. And yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, but you bring us, so we are hopping around these premises now, and I see us now, we have arrived at which is, I think, this part about defending new commons. When you say act, I hear you saying, as Ewan put it, the ways in which caring and acting in solidarity with another will necessitate the constitution in defense of new forms of commons. So there's ways in which the steps we take now are building something already. It's not, it's, there's always this sort of question of, let's say, the map and the territory or representation. When we're talking speculation, is it a thought exercise, or is it, can we speculate in our own lives, in the steps we take, in the way we embody things, try things out? I wonder if perhaps prototyping and speculating and the way you formulated them are not a little closer to each other than it seemed. Maybe I'm being optimistic.
I thought of an answer while you were talking, and then it just like, you know, just disappeared from my brain. But I did have something in mind. But wait, hang on. Maybe somebody else wants to step in because I need to regather my train of thought.
My question here was about the commons. So of course this is a popular term now. You got it?
Yeah. I think like this new project of the commons, like I think it's just this word new. To me, it's the way I see it, it's a continuing effort. It's not that we're inventing this idea that's of like, you know, this idea of the commons now. It's not that now we're starting to think of collaboration instead of competition in the art world. It's understanding that these efforts have been going on. And I guess now is the time to retake them with more, or take these assignments or prototypes, experiments, speculations, take them in our hands with greater care and, you know, push them forward with more fervor. But yeah, I guess we're not starting this now. Like, we didn't start the fire, as Paley Joel said. No, it's where this is, now is the time, I guess, to push a higher gear, but like to understand what is already happening, what is already latent in this landscape, who is already doing, with whom can I form allyships, rather than start something completely new. I think that's another thing that happens in post-disaster situations. You think, oh, I'm going to start a new new organizations, new like aid structures. It's like, no, what is already there? What is already happening in this community, and how can we galvanize that rather than build a new monolith and build a new incorporate something new. It's what is latent, what is around, and how can we.
This is perhaps more of a permaculture as approach to commoning than sort of like what are the things that are growing, what do you prune and what do you add, and how do you care for what's there. Yeah.
Yes. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, it is this idea of studying the landscape and understanding what is latent.
We are entering the final 5 minutes. Oh, Ian, go ahead. Yeah.
I'll try to be very quick. I mean, I think this idea of the commons is really important, but it's also incredibly difficult to think just because I don't think there are commons right now, or if they are, they're very fragile and fleeting. You know, everything is like private or public, like managed privately or by governments. And so the examples that we have of commons, I think most often are just these kind of like very minor kind of exceptions to the normal situation. You know, we can think of like the movement of the squares, like all of the protest movements that happened following the financial crisis in 2008, as being a kind of grand experiment in constitution of new kinds of commons. You know, like in Cairo, the kind of emptying out of the city and constitution of these camps, and across Europe, all these different protest camps and Occupy in the US, et cetera. But of course, the problem there was like, you know, there was actually this successful constitution of so many commons, and they fell when the state decided to attack them. You know, like as soon as the police decided they didn't want to let them exist any longer, they kind of went away. And so that's like a real struggle. It's not like we can simply just be more generous and organize ourselves and then act as if that will produce a new society. There's this real kind of conflict that emerges whenever commons appear. So I think that's the one thing. But the second danger, particularly in the pandemic, I think, is that now with this kind of politics of abandonment, which is so kind of rife, particularly in the West, I think this kind of position that the government is just kind of telling everyone, you know, you're kind of on your own and try not to get sick. I think the danger is that we kind of enact these commons and we kind of take care of each other and kind of get through this. And then on the other side of the pandemic, everything goes back to normal, right? And so this kind of constitution of commons and practice of care becomes just another mode of survival for kind of like the capitalist system. And that's particularly what I worry about now, is that I think all of these kinds of horizontal projects and collaborations are incredibly important. But the question is how to allow them to grow and resonate with one another and become something else and not just like a temporary band-aid on the present situation.
Thank you, Ian. I think sharing the things we worry about or the questions that linger on is perhaps a good way to end this round. Would you like to add anything to that, Ian, what you just shared? In terms of what are the lingering questions for you after this conversation?
I mean, I appreciate that care became a real topic of conversation because I think that's incredibly central to not only the present kind of exigencies of the crisis, but also for like what it would mean to imagine a different kind of society. I think that reorganization of care is absolutely essential to that. But also this conversation around work, I think, is also important. You know, I think the example of Argentina has been brought up a few times, and I mean that's an important reference point for our present as well, right? Like when there's this total financial collapse, how do people reorganize society in a way that still manages them to reproduce themselves and to provide for the needs of the people and all these kinds of things? And so I would just encourage us all to remain speculative and to put those speculations into practice, because without that, I just worry that all of the things all the inequalities, all the forms of domination that we're used to will just kind of, this pandemic will just end up being an opportunity to exaggerate those. So, yeah.
Yeah. Matthijs, what are the things that you are the thoughts or the questions that are lingering with you after this conversation?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to realize that this period is, I think, for maybe all of us, the most extreme period we have lived in. And so this crisis, I think, first we have this virus, and then we get probably in a very deep economical crisis. I think nobody has ever lived, well, maybe if you have lived in the 30s in the United States, maybe, but I think this is more extreme than Argentina 2001, absolutely. That was very extreme, and it's very extreme when a state is collapsing completely. But at this moment, it's going deeper, much deeper. And this is, well, of course, I'm afraid also. Everybody is afraid. And this is very scary. It's a very scary time at this moment. And also, what for me at this moment is, and then I go back to, let's say, the virus is social. You know, if we are walking on the street and somebody pass by, you treat him as an enemy. You know, he can be a danger for me. And that is so extreme. And I think it's now already 2 months that you have to live like this. But I'm really afraid, is this going to stay in my head? That the other is an enemy. And well, how can we solve that? I think this is a very important thing. So I think that's why it's very important to think also about other possibilities of creating another kind of society. And of course, it is very utopian at this moment, but without an utopian idea, we can never get somewhere.
Thank you. Clara?
I would say that, I mean, just kind of synthesizing my thoughts of like when listening to both Ian and Matthijs, yeah, that there are places where crisis is constant, and there have been ways of doing that can be learned from. And yeah, to remember that there are other realities that can be approached for information and for exchange of knowledge. These things perhaps don't exist here, but they may exist elsewhere with people who have been struggling or at risk for a long time. In the same way that we're learning from, you know, like the people who have been terminally ill are like saying, oh yeah, this is like our life. And now we have like, you know, kind of strategies to show you. So yeah, just remember that this feeling of the other as, yeah, or this feeling of the other being unsafe or a possible danger. There are people who live with this on a daily basis. So to, again, yeah, not refuse speculation or not refuse action, but to understand that maybe to somewhere there is knowledge that can be shared, and how do we approach these communities who have something to share in a way that is not exploitative, and in a way that is caring and careful and respectful, I think. So if we're going to collaborate with each other across borders, I think in Ian's text it said like to ignore borders or to ignore their existence. It's if we're going to collapse the borders, then we need to be respectful of this the politics of trespassing. And I guess that's how I would end.
Thank you. If I may also end with my own thoughts of all of what I hear primarily in all of the rich conversation is something that Ian already stated as the preamble for today, which is talking about this question of what's novel, what's a continuation, what does it already exists, and what I hear throughout it all is this sense that many of the things that we need exist, but they're not in the right places yet. So this redistribution of knowledge or asking questions, assuming that you might not have to invent it, but to listen or to learn from also suggests a rethinking knowledge and how like who has expertise in crisis. Oftentimes expertise is considered to be something that you gain from studying or being in positions of power. And in a shared condition of powerlessness, the experts in this situation are the people who have been through the most in different situations. So I'm thinking about the ways in which there is a shifting expertise or a necessity to do that. And as you said, Clara, in a non-exploitative way, to tune in, it requires a humble position. It requires a sort of this figuring things out by looking to other times, to other places. And I guess the challenge I would think then is, how do we, let's say, learn translocally when we're stuck in our homes, right? And for me, this conversation has been an amazing sort of taste of that it is still possible. Right? It is still possible to learn in a way that we might not have had this configuration without sort of the sense of a shared crisis. And the temporal question, I mean, I think it was Latour who said this crisis is a dress rehearsal in some ways for, say, climate crisis, which is slower and therefore harder to perceive in a ways. And I think it's interesting to think about the ways in which what we are not only, let's say, speculating or prototyping, we're also building the infrastructure for some future. Perhaps the premises we can build on. I just realized that I have been a negligent moderator and I missed a question. Can we end with answering the one question that has not been answered, coming from the YouTube channel from Surabaya Johnny? I'm not sure if I said it correctly. There seems to be a tension between needing to organize internationally and bottom up, or kinship-based organization. So tension between these different ways of organizing ourselves. Can we combine the two? And if yes, can we give an example? So we're going to end practically. How can we organize ourselves? Based between, let's say, between the international grassroots and the kinship-based model in our boat. Are these forms of organization compatible? And if so, how could that work?
It's a rather large question to end on.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Do we have another like half an hour? But I guess I would say just very briefly, because we're that yes, it is possible, and I think it's time to burn the candle at both ends. Like there's no one solution, and indeed, like there are certain like issues of climate are extremely large and cannot be solved we can't grassroots our way out of it. Like there has to be, systemic policy, economic, political, like a concerted effort behind it. But at the same time, you can work locally in your community while finding a way, if you can, like to be involved in this larger discussion. I mean, there's in the same way that, yes, there's a tension between the professional and the personal and the public and the private. Yes, there are, but these aren't binaries. They're not like fixed, it's a one or the other. It's how do you find your own fluid way to, or maybe you're more kind of a local actor than but yeah, there is no right way. And that would be the most dangerous thing, I think, to think that there is one right way, because then we would be wasting the possibility of another solution. There are many solutions. It's just how do we work together. I think it's not a tension, it's a connection, I would say.
Ian, I see you nodding. Is that an agreement?
Well, no, I mean, I think foundational to all of this is the understanding that the responses to this are necessarily going to have to be incredibly diverse. And I mean, I guess this is why I'm skeptical of a formal organization as a kind of answer to these kinds of questions. And I mean, I think there's certainly room for forms of kind of local organizing and this kind of thing. But I don't know. I mean, I think on the one hand, the problem is total, and all the systems we're interested in fighting and combating are planetary at this point. You know, capitalism, financial capitalism, in particular, climate crisis, and now the pandemic. And so it's going to involve radical cooperation and solidarity across, you know, impossibly diverse contexts. You know, and I mentioned it in the text very briefly, but I think, you know, what it looks like to engage in political struggle in Mexico City or in Rome or in Beijing or in New York or in Amsterdam, anywhere, it's going to be necessarily radically different. And so if that becomes the starting point for thinking about emancipatory politics, the question becomes not about how to kind of make all these things conform to one kind of grand plan or one kind of grand form of organization, rather to imagine forms of solidarity that allow these things to kind of resonate together and to amount to something larger than just their constituent parts. And again, I don't think we should be so pessimistic because, you know, like we have in our lifetimes, like two very recent examples of this. The movement of the squares, I think, was one example of this. Like people write this off as a kind of failure, but that was a moment where there was this kind of global revolt taking shape that kind of burnt out under the weight of police repression. But nonetheless, we saw these forms of kind of diverse revolt and solidarity taking shape in that period. And then, you know, it's easy to forget, but right before the pandemic, there was another wave of planetary revolt taking shape that were kind of, you know, again, kind of cut short by the arrival of the contagion.
Such a stark contrast. Such a stark contrast between a half year ago and now.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you look at Hong Kong and Chile and I mean, Algeria, there were just like these huge, unprecedented popular revolts taking shape just a few months ago. And so I don't think we should allow ourselves to just assume, again, that this is just something that's happening to us. But there is this kind of collective desire for something otherwise. And I think we need to cultivate that and move on to it.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we've run over time. I would love to keep carrying on this conversation for hours, but I'd like to thank each of you, Ian, Clara, Matthijs, and Zar, and hand the word back to AV before we close. Thank you, Frame for the invitation, bringing us together in this conversation. And would you like to end, AV?
Yeah, I'd just like to jump in and say thank you to everyone. Also people who watched, but you guys for coming on as guests, taking time out, and especially thank you to Shailoh for moderating a really wonderful discussion. I think, as Clara mentioned before, I myself am still digesting what's going on, and I think it's quite an important stance to take to recognize that we are feeling stuck right now, and that it's possible to say, I have no idea what's happening. I don't know what is going to happen, but then to take the action now. And I think this conversation is a part of that. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.